In the dead of winter, when the winds of history sweep silently across forgotten landscapes, there are tales that refuse to vanish. Among them is one so strange, so unsettling, that it challenges the very boundaries of human understanding. It begins in a time shrouded by snow and superstition, in a land where every shadow seemed to hide whispers from the past. And at the center of it all stood a child, a boy whose voice carried echoes of something forbidden. The story does not come from rumor alone. It rests in fragments of journals, official records, and the haunted testimonies of those who swore they witnessed the impossible. They spoke of a language unlike any other, a tongue that seemed both ancient and alien, flowing with rhythms no human throat should ever have produced. This was not a forgotten dialect, nor the remnant of a lost tribe. What the boy spoke was something else, something that should not have existed at all. Witnesses described it as both beautiful and terrifying, like music woven with mathematics, a melody that seemed to awaken forgotten corners of the mind. And yet, within its harmony was a dissonance, a wrongness, that unsettled even the bravest among them. Some whispered that the child was a messenger. Others feared he was a curse. All agreed on one thing: his voice would change everything they thought they knew about life, language, and perhaps even reality itself. Before we unravel the secrets of this mystery, pause for a moment and consider. Could you face a truth that does not belong to this world? If you are ready to step into the unknown, make sure you subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments below. The shadows have much more to reveal. To truly understand the mystery of the boy and his forbidden language, we must first return to the world into which he appeared. The year was 1821. Across Europe, the scars of war and revolution still lingered, and in the Scottish Highlands, life was harsher than ever. Entire villages had been uprooted during the Highland clearances, families torn from their ancestral lands to make way for sheep farming. Communities that had once thrived were now shadows of themselves, clinging to survival in isolated pockets of rock, sea, and snow. One such place was the remote village of Inverare, tucked deep within the Highland valleys. Home to scarcely 300 souls, it was a community defined by hard work, superstition, and silence. Farmers tended rocky fields, fishermen braved icy waters, and every winter was a test of endurance against hunger and frost. The people of Inverare were deeply religious, their lives shaped by Presbyterian faith, yet still haunted by ancient Celtic legends that refused to die. Old stories of spirits, omens, and voices in the wind traveled from hearth to hearth on stormy nights. By early February, the winter of 1821 had already proven merciless. Heavy snows cut the village off from the outside world, sealing narrow mountain passes and burying the few roads that led toward distant towns. For weeks, Inverare was locked in silence, with only the howling wind as a reminder of the world beyond. Food stores ran low, sickness spread quickly, and the villagers feared that this winter might take more lives than the last. In a place where every stranger was a spectacle, the appearance of an unknown child on a frozen morning would have been remarkable enough. But in a community starved of hope and riddled with superstition, the boy's arrival carried an almost prophetic weight. To the villagers, it was as though the storm itself had delivered him, a sign from heaven or perhaps from something far darker. What they could not have known on that bleak February day was that his presence would ignite questions that stretched far beyond their village. This was not simply a tale of survival or folklore. It was the beginning of a mystery that would ripple outward through science, government, and history itself. And it all began with the sound of a voice, spoken in a language no human should have known. The morning of February 14th, 1821, began like any other in Inverare. Snow blanketed the village in a thick, unbroken sheet of white, and the narrow lanes were silent, muffled by the cold weight of winter. It was Margaret McTavish, the village schoolteacher, who first saw him. She rose early, bundled herself against the bitter air, and walked toward the small stone schoolhouse at the edge of the settlement. As she reached the door, she stopped. There, seated upon the icy steps, was a child she had never seen before. He could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old, with pale skin touched by the cold and dark hair matted from frost. But it was not his appearance that froze her in place. It was his clothing. The boy wore garments unlike anything Margaret had ever known. Thin, silken fabric that shimmered faintly in the weak morning light, cut in a style that belonged neither to the Highlands nor to any land she recognized. Then his eyes met hers. Margaret would later write in her diary that his gaze was unlike anything she had experienced before. His eyes seemed brighter than they should have been, almost reflective, catching the light in a way that made her feel as though she were being studied as much as she was observing him. Gathering her courage, she spoke first in English, then in Scottish Gaelic, and finally in the little French she knew. The boy listened intently but gave no reply in any familiar tongue. Instead, he opened his mouth and spoke words that flowed like music over stones. Soft, fluid, and strangely melodic. The sounds were beautiful but unsettling. They carried a sense of intent, of logic, yet they conformed to no language Margaret or anyone else had ever heard. Margaret tried again, pointing to the wooden door of the schoolhouse. The boy responded eagerly, speaking in his strange tongue, repeating the word with variations, as though he were naming it. When she pointed to her lantern, he did the same. It was as if he were trying to teach her, not the other way around. What unnerved her most was not that she could not understand him, but that his language felt wrong, impossible. The syllables bent and twisted in ways the human voice should not have been able to produce. And yet, within that impossibility, there was unmistakable order, as though every sound followed a secret mathematical law. In that moment, standing in the frozen stillness of Inverare, Margaret understood one thing with dreadful certainty. This was no ordinary child, and his voice carried secrets the world was never meant to hear. Once Margaret brought the boy inside the schoolhouse, curiosity quickly gave way to a strange unease. The child remained calm, even polite, but he never ceased speaking in his unknown tongue. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a lost child, but the longer Margaret listened, the more she realized there was structure hidden within the sounds. This was no gibberish. It was language, but language that felt utterly alien. The breakthrough came when Margaret began pointing to objects around the room. A book, a chair, a candle. Each time, the boy eagerly supplied a word from his language. When she lifted a single book, he said something that sounded like Thylon. When she placed two books together, he repeated Thylon but added another word, forming Thylon Verith. With 3 books, it shifted again to Thylon Verith Kyle. But when she gathered 4 books, the pattern broke entirely. The boy spoke a completely different word, Mundara. 5 books? Again, Mundara. Margaret, though no scholar, sensed at once that the boy's speech obeyed principles unlike any she had ever encountered. This was not the decimal counting of human tongues. His words seemed to follow a base 4 system, mathematics woven directly into language. Each phrase was precise, logical, and yet disturbingly inhuman. When she later shared this discovery with Dr. Hayesham Loud, the village physician, he was astonished. To him, the boy's speech patterns resembled not merely a language but a kind of coded system, where meaning and number merged seamlessly. The idea chilled him, a child whose very words might encode mathematics beyond human comprehension. And yet, it was not only numbers. The rhythm of the speech carried a musical quality, flowing in measures that felt deliberate, almost symphonic. Witnesses said it was as if the boy were composing reality itself with each syllable, drawing invisible patterns in the air. Some villagers, listening from the schoolhouse windows, whispered that the words made their heads ache, as though the language itself pressed against their minds. More unsettling still were the sounds themselves. Dr. Mloud later recorded that the boy's throat produced tones that should have been impossible, frequencies higher and lower than any human voice could reach. Certain syllables resonated in ways that caused lantern glass to tremble. Others vibrated in the chest like a low drumbeat, leaving listeners unsettled long after the sound had ceased. Professor Alastair Dunor, a linguist who arrived weeks later, spent hours documenting these utterances. His verdict was chilling. The boy's language contained concepts no human tongue could express, built for a mind that could process multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. It was, he wrote, a linguistic architecture not of this earth. And yet, the most disturbing revelation was this: the language did not remain fixed. Words the boy used in the first days shifted in later weeks, refined, restructured, as if the child were evolving his own tongue in real time. Dunor concluded that the boy was attempting to adapt, reshaping his forbidden language to make it more comprehensible to human ears. But if that was true, one question loomed above all: what mind had created such a language in the first place? Word of the strange boy spread quickly through Inverare, and by the second day, nearly half the village had gathered at the schoolhouse to see him. Among them was Dr. Haish Mloud, the village physician. A man of science, trained at the University of Edinburgh, Mloud arrived expecting to dismiss the rumors as mere superstition. But the moment he examined the child, his certainty began to unravel. The boy was physically healthy, yet certain features immediately struck Mloud as abnormal. His skull was slightly larger than average for his age, with subtle ridges along areas associated with speech and cognition. His eyes, which villagers had already described as strangely luminous, responded to light in ways no human eyes should. Instead of the natural dilation and contraction of pupils, his eyes shifted in complex patterns, as though following a rhythm invisible to anyone else. The most shocking discovery, however, came when Mloud examined the boy's throat. The vocal cords were unlike any he had studied in anatomy. Additional strands of muscle and cartilage allowed the child to produce tones across a range far beyond human capability. Some fibers vibrated at frequencies too high for most ears, while others rumbled so low they resonated in the chest of those nearby. It was as if his body had been built for language that transcended human limits. When the boy spoke during the examination, instruments in the room vibrated, glassware quivered, and a physician's pocket watch skipped faintly, as if tugged by unseen hands. To Mloud, it seemed the sounds themselves carried power, frequencies that interacted with the physical world. Even the boy's heartbeat was extraordinary. Instead of the steady two-beat rhythm of a human heart, his pulse followed a complex four-beat sequence with calculated pauses. Mloud listened again and again, convinced at first that his instruments were failing. But every time, the same unnatural rhythm persisted, a pulse that seemed mathematical, deliberate. When scholars from outside the village arrived, among them Professor Alastair Dunor, a linguist, and Dr. Erasmus, a physician attached to the crown, the anomalies deepened. Dunor noted that the boy's language not only encoded meaning but seemed capable of expressing scientific concepts without equations. He speaks in structures that contain mathematics within the very grammar, Dunor wrote. It is less a language than a form of living computation. Dr. Erasmus, in contrast, focused on the medical impossibilities. The boy's reflexes were sharper than normal, his senses unervingly acute. During one test, he reacted to the faint strike of a tuning fork long after the sound had passed, claiming he could still hear vibrations no one else could. Another time, he pointed toward the stars at night and murmured rapid syllables, as if addressing something far beyond sight. What disturbed the scholars most was the boy's apparent awareness. He did not behave as an ignorant child stumbling through strange abilities. Instead, he seemed to understand exactly what he was doing, as though his language, his body, and even his heartbeat were part of a design he alone could comprehend. By the end of their studies, none of the experts could agree on an explanation. Some whispered of a mutation, others of divine intervention. A few, in hushed tones, wondered if he had come from elsewhere entirely. But all were united in one conclusion: this was no ordinary child. He was something other. By the end of February, the boy was no longer just a curiosity. He had become the center of every whisper in Inverare. Farmers abandoned their work to gather at the schoolhouse windows. Children spoke of him in fearful tones, and the church elders debated whether he was a miracle or a curse. For every villager who believed the child was sent from heaven, another swore he was a harbinger of doom. In a place where superstition ran deep, his very existence divided the community. The tension grew worse when strange incidents began to unfold. Villagers reported hearing his voice at night, even when they were far from the schoolhouse. A fisherman swore that while mending his nets by the shore, the boy's words drifted to him on the wind, though the child had not left his bed. Others claimed his speech left behind echoes that lingered in their minds, repeating themselves long after the boy had fallen silent. It was only a matter of time before word spread beyond the mountains. By early March, strangers began to arrive. First scholars, then men whose purpose was less clear. They came in carriages bearing the insignia of the crown, their presence quiet but unmistakable. At their head was Colonel James Worthington, a stern officer from the Military Intelligence Service, accompanied by Dr. Erasmus and Professor Cornelius Ashworth, a linguist whose reputation for studying ancient languages was unmatched. From the moment they arrived, the tone of the investigation changed. Villagers were ordered to stay away from the boy. The schoolhouse was placed under guard, its windows shuttered, and only authorized personnel were permitted to speak with the child. What had been a local mystery was now treated as a matter of state security. Colonel Worthington saw danger where others saw wonder. Reports suggest he was disturbed not only by the boy's voice, but also by his drawings. Intricate diagrams of unknown places, strange constellations, and geometric shapes linked by networks of lines. To the villagers, they were nonsense. To Worthington, they were maps. Maps, he insisted, that bore unsettling resemblance to classified military installations. Professor Ashworth was equally troubled. In private notes later uncovered, he wrote that the boy's language encodes information that should not exist in any human mind. He warned that exposure to it might alter the way people thought, as if the very structure of the words could infect the human mind like a seed. Meanwhile, Margaret McTavish grew increasingly alarmed. In her diary, she described seeing the boy escorted outside for brief walks, his once bright eyes now dimmer, his body weaker. "They are draining something from him," she wrote. "It is as if the light within him is fading." The villagers whispered that the crown was not studying the boy but silencing him. And late at night, as guards patrolled the schoolhouse, several claimed they heard sounds unlike any human speech echoing from within, distorted voices, as if the boy were conversing with something far away. By mid-April, the village no longer spoke of miracles. They spoke of fear. And with the government's arrival, the boy's fate was sealed. Whatever secrets his forbidden language carried, they now belonged to forces far beyond Inverare. As spring approached, the boy's behavior grew more unsettling. He spent long hours staring at the sky, his strange eyes following constellations with an intensity that frightened those who dared watch him. Margaret McTavish recorded in her diary that he often spoke rapidly into the night air, as though addressing unseen listeners among the stars. At times his voice carried urgency, at other times despair, as if he were warning of something only he could perceive. The warnings became terrifyingly real on March 15, 1821. That evening, the boy grew agitated, pacing the schoolhouse floor, pointing frantically toward the heavens while shouting in his impossible tongue. Witnesses described his tone as desperate, almost pleading. 2 days later, a violent snowstorm struck Inverare without warning. It lasted exactly 3 days, collapsing roofs, scattering livestock, and cutting the village off from the world once more. When the storm cleared, many remembered the boy's frantic cries. To them, he had not merely predicted the disaster, he had announced it. More incidents followed. In early April, the boy awoke screaming, his words sharp and urgent. Days later, a landslide blocked the mountain trail leading east. Later that month, he pointed toward the village church, speaking with dreadful intensity. That same week, a fire broke out in its bell tower, destroying the roof before it could be contained. Again and again, his words seemed to carry warnings of events no one else could foresee. But predictions were not the only mysteries. Given charcoal and paper to occupy him, the boy filled pages with drawings that left even scholars shaken. They were not the sketches of a child but precise diagrams, geometric shapes interwoven with complex formulas, constellations aligned with impossible patterns, and maps of places no villager recognized. One drawing in particular disturbed Colonel Worthington. It resembled a network of connected structures, eerily similar to a layout of restricted British military sites. How could a child, cut off from the outside world, have knowledge of such things? The tension reached its peak in May. Villagers began reporting strange lights in the night sky, hovering above the mountains, moving in silence. Others swore they saw shadows circling the schoolhouse even when guards stood watch. Margaret wrote that the boy's once bright presence was fading, as though the very effort of bridging his language to humanity was draining his life away. Then, on May 12th, he was gone. The official records claimed he had been transferred to appropriate facilities for continued study, but those who witnessed his removal told another story. Thomas McBride, the village blacksmith, described seeing a covered carriage leave before dawn, flanked by soldiers. Inside, he glimpsed the boy, yet not alone. There were shapes beside him, McBride later wrote, figures that moved like people but bent in ways no man should. Others reported hearing his voice echo across the village as the carriage rolled away, not from his lips alone but from the very air, vibrating through walls and windows alike. Some swore the carriage made no sound as it traveled the frozen road. A few even claimed they saw lights in the sky following it into the mountains. Whether truth or superstition, one fact remained. The boy who spoke the forbidden language had vanished from Inverrare, leaving behind only terror, unanswered questions, and the chilling sense that the story was far from over. The disappearance of the boy should have ended the story. Yet, in truth, it marked only the beginning of a mystery that would ripple through generations. Though the official record claimed he had been taken into government care, no one in Inverrare ever saw him again. But his absence did not silence the echoes of his forbidden language. Just 3 months later, in August of 1821, a disturbing case emerged in Edinburgh. A young scholar collapsed during a scientific experiment and, upon regaining consciousness, began speaking in a language none could identify. His speech patterns mirrored those described in the boy's case: mathematical rhythms, tones that unsettled the air, and words that defied transcription. Days later, he recovered with no memory of what he had said. In the years that followed, similar incidents multiplied. Soldiers wounded in battle, scholars fevered by illness, and even ordinary villagers across the British Isles were reported to suddenly speak in the strange tongue during altered states of consciousness. Always the same. The language surfaced, filled the air with impossible syllables, then vanished as if it had never been. Physicians documented more than 40 such cases between 1821 and 1830. But the influence was not limited to the ill or delirious. Some of the greatest scientific minds of the century would later confess to moments of inspiration that seemed guided by something beyond themselves. Gregor Mendel, father of genetics, wrote cryptically in his letters of dreams in which a child taught me patterns. Nikola Tesla spoke of electric whispers in a language of numbers. Even Albert Einstein, years later, described flashes of inspiration that felt like equations spoken by the cosmos itself. Were these coincidences? Or was the forbidden language still moving, whispering, reshaping the future through chosen minds? The sightings, too, did not end. In 1835, a merchant in Dublin claimed to see a boy, unchanged in age since the Inverrare incident, speaking to sailors in words that caused glasses to vibrate on their tables. In 1841, a physician in Bristol treated a child with an injury who spoke the impossible language, only for him to vanish overnight, leaving strange symbols carved into the walls. The most chilling account came during the Great Famine in 1847, when Father Michael O'Sullivan reported meeting a child among starving refugees who spoke in the very tongue once described in Inverrare. The boy, he wrote, seemed to know his most private thoughts. Days later, O'Sullivan was found dead in his chambers, his walls covered with hundreds of the forbidden symbols. By mid-century, the sightings abruptly ceased, yet the legacy endured. Patterns appeared wherever human knowledge leapt forward: scientific discoveries, technological revolutions, ideas that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Historians would later argue that the places touched by the boy's language became centers of progress within a single generation. To the villagers of Inverrare, it was a curse they wished to forget. To scholars, it was a puzzle that gnawed at the edges of reason. And to those who whispered of conspiracies, it was proof that the boy had never left, that his voice still moved, silently guiding the course of human history. In the years since the boy's disappearance, Countless theories have been proposed to explain what truly happened in Inverare. Each one offers a possible key, yet none unlock the full mystery. Some scholars have argued the child was a time traveler, carrying fragments of knowledge from a distant future. His language, they suggest, may have been the evolved tongue of humanity, built not on words alone but on mathematics, sound frequencies, and multidimensional logic. If so, he may have been sent back, intentionally or accidentally, to reveal what lies ahead for our species. Others point toward the possibility of extraterrestrial contact. The boy's speech patterns, mathematical structures, and strange diagrams have been interpreted as evidence of a language designed for universal communication. To these theorists, the child was not human at all but a messenger from beyond, placed in a remote village to study, guide, or perhaps even test us. A more spiritual interpretation sees him as a prophetic figure, a vessel through which otherworldly truths flowed. Supporters of this view point to the boy's accurate predictions, his effect on scientific minds, and the fear he inspired in religious leaders. To them, his voice was both warning and revelation. There is also the disturbing possibility raised by modern linguists that the boy represented an evolutionary leap in consciousness. His language may have been less about communication and more about reshaping thought itself, an architecture of the mind capable of altering how humans perceive reality. If that is true, then the influence of his words did not end with him. Every person exposed to his language may have carried fragments of it forward, spreading it silently across generations. Time traveler, alien, prophet, or future human. Each theory leaves us with unsettling questions. What if his purpose was not to visit us, but to change us? What if the forbidden language has never truly vanished, but still lingers, guiding our progress in ways we cannot yet comprehend? 2 centuries have passed since the boy vanished from Inverare, yet his shadow still stretches across time. Was he a traveler from our future, an envoy from the stars, or the first glimpse of what humanity itself might become? We may never know, but what cannot be denied is the echo he left behind. An impossible language, carried on whispers, woven into dreams, and etched into the very progress of human history. Perhaps you've felt it too. A strange word on the edge of sleep, an idea that arrives as if spoken from beyond, a pattern that seems too perfect to be chance. If so, maybe his voice still lingers, waiting for those willing to listen. One thing is certain. The boy's story is not just a tale from the past. It is a warning, a question, and perhaps even an invitation. The forbidden language was never meant to be forgotten, and maybe it never was. If you want more journeys into the mysteries that haunt our world, subscribe now to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments. The next secret may already be waiting,